You find their profile at 2 in the morning, not because you are looking for anything specific, just scrolling the way you always do before sleep. And there it is again. The same quiet fact you have somehow trained yourself not to notice. Months of closeness. Late nights that turned into mornings. Inside jokes nobody else would understand. And not one photo, not one tag, not one single trace of you anywhere a stranger could find. If someone who has never met either of you looked at their entire public life, they would have no reason to believe you exist. You know their friends by name. You know their coffee order, their sleep schedule, the specific way they get quiet before they get honest. And publicly, you are nothing. Not hidden dramatically, not denied if someone asked directly, just quietly, consistently, absent. That gap between how real this feels when you are alone together and how invisible it is the second other people are watching is not a small detail you are being sensitive about. It is the entire pattern, and it deserves to be named plainly instead of explained away one more time. If this kind of clarity helps your nervous system settle, subscribe. Psych Bond is a daily decoder for psychology, relationships, and avoidant and anxious attachment patterns, so you stop guessing. Let's start with what this actually is, because the instinct to minimize it is strong, and it deserves to be interrupted early. Being kept off someone's timeline is not a small cosmetic omission. It is a decision, made repeatedly, about where the boundary of your relationship is allowed to end. Private intimacy and real-life integration are not the same thing, even though they feel like they should be. Private intimacy is what happens between two people when no one else is watching. The texting, the closeness, the version of them that only you get to see. Real-life integration is whether that private version is allowed to exist anywhere else. In front of friends, in front of family, in the public record of their life that other people can actually see. Someone can give you extraordinary amounts of the first while giving you almost none of the second. And your body will feel that gap as confusion long before your mind can name it. Because you are receiving something that feels like everything in private and almost nothing in public. And those two signals do not match. This is why being left off the timeline hits differently than other slights. It is not about vanity, and it was never about needing a public post to feel validated in some shallow way. It is about what public acknowledgment has always signaled to the human nervous system, going back long before timelines existed at all. Public declaration used to be a resource-level decision. Introducing someone to your group, your family, your tribe was never neutral. It meant you were vouching for them, extending your protection to them, treating them as attached to your own survival and standing. Keeping someone private, by contrast, meant keeping your options open, keeping your resources undivided, keeping an exit available in case things did not work out. Your nervous system did not invent this framework recently. It inherited it fully intact, and it still reads public inclusion as a proxy for how much someone is willing to risk on your behalf. Whether or not either of you has ever consciously thought about it that way. In small ancestral groups, there was no meaningful difference between a private relationship and a secret one, because there was no way to be close to someone without the rest of the group eventually knowing about it. Privacy at that scale of life was not really an option, which means your nervous system never had to evolve a category for it. What it evolved instead was a very sensitive detector for exactly this kind of asymmetry. Someone who is close to you privately while remaining unclaimed publicly. Because in the environment your body was built for, that asymmetry almost always meant something specific was being protected, usually at your expense. This is also why the explanation rarely satisfies the feeling, even when it is offered kindly. You can be told, honestly, that someone simply is not a person who posts much, and still feel unsettled, because your nervous system is not actually asking about their general posting habits. It is asking a much older, much blunter question underneath the surface one, which is whether you are considered attached enough to their identity to be worth the risk of public claim. A calm explanation can satisfy your mind for a few minutes. It rarely satisfies the older system underneath it, the one still quietly running the original threat assessment, regardless of how reasonable the explanation sounds. Here is the part that makes this pattern so hard to simply reason your way out of. You can know, intellectually, that a photo or a tag is just pixels on a screen, that plenty of healthy relationships exist without much social media presence at all. And that logic is not wrong in isolation. But your body does not process this pattern by looking at one photo in isolation. It processes it by comparing the private version of the relationship against the public one. And when the private version is warm, consistent, and specific, while the public version is completely blank, that contrast itself becomes the data point, regardless of how you try to rationalize the individual pieces. You are not overreacting to a missing photo. You are accurately reading a structural gap between two very different versions of the same relationship. And your nervous system was built to notice exactly that kind of inconsistency. Now let's talk about why this specific gap creates such a particular, persistent kind of doubt. Because understanding the mechanism matters more than just naming the feeling. Most emotional wounds involve something that happened. This one involves something that consistently does not happen. And absence is much harder for your mind to file away than an event is. An event gives you a moment to process and move past. A pattern of absence gives you an open question that never resolves. Because there is no single moment to point to, only a long, quiet accumulation of almost invitations that never quite arrive. You do not get closure from an absence. You get a slow education in reading between the lines, checking timelines, and quietly tracking who from their life you have actually met versus who exists only as a name you have heard once in passing. You can watch this exact pattern show up in very specific, recurring moments if you pay attention. It shows up when they post a picture from a work trip with 3 coworkers you have never met, tagged and captioned, while a weekend you spent together produces nothing at all. It shows up when a casual friend from years ago gets a birthday tribute post, full of warm public language, while your own birthday together was celebrated only privately, with no trace left anywhere for anyone else to see. It shows up when you finally meet 1 or 2 people from their life, almost by accident, at an event you were not formally invited to as their partner, introduced quickly as someone who happened to be there, rather than someone who matters. None of these moments look dramatic in isolation. One missing tag, one quiet introduction. But tracked together, they form a very consistent map of exactly how visible you are allowed to be. It is worth being precise here, because this pattern is easy to misread in both directions. Not everyone who avoids public posting is hiding you specifically. Some people are private about everything, evenly, across every relationship they have ever had, never posting anyone, never tagging anyone, treating their entire life as something that simply is not meant for public consumption. That is a consistent personal boundary, not a targeted omission, and it deserves to be read as exactly that. The marker worth paying attention to is not whether someone posts rarely. It is whether you can identify other people in their life, current or past, who did appear, who did get introduced, who did exist publicly in ways you specifically do not. A single private person is a personality trait. A specific, targeted invisibility applied to you and not to others is a pattern. And those two things require completely different responses. Let's talk about what actually determines this choice, because it rarely comes from a place of malice, even when the impact on you is real and painful. Making someone public is an act of integration, and integration requires a kind of certainty that some people are not able to offer yet, or are actively avoiding offering on purpose. Posting you, tagging you, introducing you to the people who matter in their life, all of that quietly upgrades the relationship's status in a way that is very difficult to undo cleanly later. It becomes a public claim, one that friends will remember, one that would require an explanation if it later disappeared. For someone who is protecting themselves from ever having to make that kind of public retraction, keeping things private is not really about you. It is about maintaining an exit that never has to be explained to anyone else, an exit that stays clean precisely because nothing was ever announced in the first place. This is where the avoidant structure becomes especially visible, because it explains a contradiction that otherwise feels impossible to reconcile. You can be someone this person is genuinely, deeply drawn to, someone they choose to spend real time with, real vulnerability with, and still remain someone they keep out of the public record of their life. Warmth in private and invisibility in public are not actually contradictory signals once you understand what each one is measuring. Private warmth measures comfort, attraction, and ease in the moment. Public integration measures willingness to be accountable for the relationship in front of other people, over time, with all the complications that accountability brings. Someone can score high on the first and low on the second, and that gap, not a lack of genuine connection, is usually what produces exactly this pattern. Let's go a layer deeper, because this often traces back to a very specific fear about what public acknowledgement actually costs an avoidant nervous system. Once something is public, it stops being something only the two of you control. Other people start asking about it. Family starts expecting updates. Friends start forming opinions and expectations. For someone whose primary strategy for feeling safe is maintaining control over their own exposure, that loss of control can feel less like a celebration of the relationship and more like a kind of exposure they did not sign up for. Keeping you private is not necessarily a statement about how they feel about you specifically. It is very often a blanket strategy for managing how exposed they allow themselves to become to anyone. Applied here because you are the person currently closest enough to trigger it. It also helps to notice that this pattern can show up for different underlying reasons, which is part of why it can be so confusing to read from the outside. Some people withhold public acknowledgement because they are still keeping a door open elsewhere, consciously or not, and making things public would close that door in a way they are not ready for. Others withhold it because they have been publicly burned before. watched a public relationship fall apart in front of everyone who knew about it, and are now protecting themselves from ever having to do that again, with anyone, regardless of how much they actually care about you specifically. And some withhold it simply because they have never built the muscle of integrating a partner into the rest of their life at all. Not because of you, but because they have never done it with anyone. And avoiding the unfamiliar feels safer than attempting it. Knowing which version you are dealing with will not erase the sting of being left off the timeline, but it will change what the pattern is actually telling you about this specific relationship, rather than what it says about avoidant behavior in general. There's another layer worth naming here too. The timeline itself is really just the most visible symptom of a much broader pattern, not the whole problem in isolation. The same underlying dynamic often shows up in smaller, quieter ways that are easy to miss if you are only watching for photos and tags. It can show up in how they introduce you when you unexpectedly run into someone they know, reaching for a vague, deliberately undefined word instead of anything that names what you actually are to each other. It can show up in how quickly the conversation changes when a mutual friend asks directly, "What is going on between you?" A question that gets deflected with humor rather than answered. The timeline is simply the most trackable, most public version of a pattern that is really about definition and claim, not about social media specifically. Which is why fixing the photo problem alone rarely fixes the underlying issue if the deeper avoidance of definition is left unaddressed. This does not mean the pattern is your fault, and it does not mean you manufactured this feeling out of insecurity. It means the pattern is often about control and exposure rather than affection. And once you can see that clearly, it becomes something you can actually ask about directly, instead of something you can only quietly monitor from a distance. Here is the part worth sitting with honestly, because control and exposure do not explain every version of this pattern, and it would be dishonest to pretend they always do. Sometimes, being kept off the timeline really is about where you rank in someone's actual priorities, and that ranking is a meaningful signal about your place in their life, not just an anxious interpretation of a neutral fact. If someone posts new coworkers, casual friends, a trip with people they barely know, but has never once posted you after months of closeness, that is not a blanket privacy preference. That is a specific decision about what your relationship is allowed to look like in public, and it deserves to be read honestly, rather than explained away indefinitely with excuses about their general personality. Let's talk about what this pattern actually costs you over time, because that cost deserves real attention instead of being minimized as something petty to get over. Being consistently left off someone's public life trains a very specific, exhausting kind of self-monitoring, where you start quietly auditing your own place in their world, comparing your visibility against other people they know, wondering what threshold you would need to cross before you became someone worth acknowledging in front of others. This vigilance is not paranoia. It is a logical response to being handed real, repeated evidence about your position, while being expected to simply not notice the pattern or bring it up. There is also a specific kind of shrinking that can happen here, one that is easy to miss because it develops slowly. If you have spent enough time being someone's private secret, you may start unconsciously downgrading your own expectations, becoming easier to keep hidden because some part of you has absorbed the belief that asking for public acknowledgement would be asking for too much, or would expose you as needy for wanting something that should apparently be optional. This is one of the quieter, more corrosive costs of this pattern. It does not just affect whether you get posted. It slowly edits how much you believe you are allowed to expect from anyone, in any relationship, going forward. There is a second cost worth naming, which is what this pattern quietly teaches you to expect from every relationship that comes after it, even ones with completely different people. If you spend long enough being someone's well-kept private secret, you can start entering new relationships already braced for invisibility, treating public acknowledgement as a bonus you should feel grateful for, rather than a normal, baseline part of being chosen. That is one of the more insidious ways this pattern outlives the relationship that created it. It does not just cost you something in the moment. It quietly recalibrates what you think is reasonable to expect the next time, and the time after that, until you have to consciously catch yourself doing it. It is also worth noticing what this does to your relationship with your own reality. When the private version of the relationship feels completely real, but there is zero public evidence to confirm it, you can start needing to manufacture your own proof just to feel steady. Screenshotting sweet texts, mentally cataloging every private moment as evidence you can replay for yourself later, because the public record offers you nothing to point to. That is an exhausting way to have to maintain your own sense of reality, and it was never meant to be your job in the first place. So, what does this actually mean practically, without turning it into a demand that every relationship needs to be broadcast the same way, because that expectation is neither realistic nor healthy for everyone involved? The first thing worth doing is separating a general privacy preference from a targeted omission, the same distinction that matters everywhere in this kind of work. Someone who posts no one, ever, evenly across their whole life is showing you a personal boundary, not a verdict about you specifically. Someone who posts everyone except you repeatedly over an extended period of time is showing you something real about where you currently rank. And that difference changes what you should actually do next. The second thing worth doing is asking directly, once, without turning it into an accusation or a test. Something as simple as noticing out loud that you have never really existed anywhere public in their life, and asking, with real curiosity instead of wounded pride, what that is actually about for them. Their answer, and how comfortable they are giving you an honest one, will tell you far more than continuing to silently track your own invisibility. Someone who responds with genuine surprise and starts making small, visible efforts to include you afterward is showing you an unconscious habit that can shift with awareness. Someone who brushes off the question entirely or treats your noticing as the actual problem is showing you something else, and you no longer have to keep guessing which one you are dealing with. The third thing worth doing is watching what actually happens after that conversation, rather than accepting a promise as if it were already the change itself. Real integration looks like specific, visible action over time, an introduction that actually happens, a tag that actually appears, a plan that includes people outside the two of you. It does not look like a single reassuring sentence followed by another 6 months of exactly the same invisibility. Give the pattern real time to either shift or confirm itself, and let the actual behavior answer the question instead of the words alone. The fourth thing worth doing has nothing to do with them at all. If you notice yourself compulsively checking their public presence, comparing your visibility to other people in their life, refreshing a feed looking for evidence that will finally settle the question, it helps to name that behavior honestly to yourself. This is the vigilance that this exact pattern creates, and it is exhausting precisely because it was never meant to be your responsibility to monitor in the first place. Notice it, name it, and let that noticing be information about what the relationship is actually costing you, rather than something to feel ashamed of needing. The fifth thing worth doing is deciding, honestly, what level of public integration you actually need to feel secure in a relationship, separate from whatever the other person currently seems willing to offer. You are allowed to want to exist publicly in someone's life, not because you need external validation to feel real, but because integration is one of the clearest, most concrete signals of whether someone is willing to build something that extends beyond the two of you alone. Wanting that is not vanity. It is a reasonable baseline, and you do not have to keep negotiating yourself down from it just because it has not been offered yet. The sixth thing worth doing is giving yourself permission to hold both truths at once, at least for a while, rather than forcing a single verdict too early. Someone can be genuinely warm with you in private and still be avoiding public claim. And both of those things can be true on the same day, in the same relationship, without one canceling out the other. You do not have to immediately decide whether this means the relationship is doomed or whether it means nothing at all. You are allowed to simply hold the pattern as real information. Keep watching whether it shifts over real time, and let your own certainty build gradually, instead of demanding an instant answer from a situation that is, by its nature, still unfolding. You are not asking for too much by wanting to exist in the public version of someone's life, not just the private one. A relationship can survive someone being generally private without any real damage, especially if that privacy is applied evenly and explained honestly. It has a much harder time surviving a permanent, unexplained, ongoing invisibility that never shifts, no matter how much time quietly passes or how real the private closeness continues to feel. Being kept off the timeline sometimes, for ordinary, explainable reasons, is simply part of how some people manage their relationship with the wider world. But being consistently, specifically left out while everyone else in their life gets acknowledged is not a small detail to be quietly absorbed one more time. What you deserve is not a public post for the sake of a post, and it was never really about the post at all. It is a relationship secure enough that your place in someone's life does not quietly depend on whether anyone else happens to be watching on that particular day, on that particular platform, under that particular set of circumstances. If this helped your body feel a little safer, liking or following this, wherever you're listening or watching, helps it reach someone else who needs this clarity. Welcome to Psych Bond. You're safe here.